Well, good day, everyone. I would like to make a few comments on the module for the week. Janice Teal has provided us, I think, a very nice, very good kind of overview of the beginning of Philip Kitcher's book here. And so I want to talk about some of the issues that arise in that. I'm not going to go through it on a blow-by-blow manner because I think Janice has done a very good job of kind of giving us the kind of lay of the land and the overview of the argument itself. So take a look at her PowerPoint and also her listen to her comments on it, and I think you can see how your reading of it lines up with hers. Before I get into that, though, a couple of comments for about the class itself, particularly what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. We're continuing on the Kitcher book, of course, but one wrinkle in all of this is that I'm going to be leaving for China in a few days. I'm going to be going next Thursday, and I'll be there for about 10 days. And so I should be able to access the course from there. There's a Canvas app that I have on the iPad, and so I should be able to address stuff that comes up from there. But I'm not entirely clear about what the what the Wi-Fi situation is going to be where I am. We're not exactly in major centers for most of the time. In case you're wondering, I'm going over there to do some lectures on American folk art with Dr. Kristen Congdon, who is a professor emerita from our department and really one of the national experts on American folk art. So um, we're going to go over there and talk a little bit about some of the work that she and I both have done on a project called China Vine, which is a project to digitize Chinese folk arts and put them on the web. If you go to chinavine.org, you'll see a lot of that work done there. So her project has been over there, but I worked on a previous project with her as well called Folkvine, and that was a project to do the same thing with Florida folk arts, and that's folkvine.org, Folkvine. So in case you're interested to see some of that, you can go there and take a look at some Florida folk arts. You might wonder, by the way, what this has to do with philosophy. And my sense of philosophy, as you probably know by now, is one which inhabits a space at the edges of the tradition of philosophy and other disciplines. Especially with the notions of place and space. And so, that kind of entree or that kind of door gives me a ways into talking as a philosopher within other areas. And so, certainly within the area of folk arts, there are issues of the kind of attachment to place and home, and sometimes migration, displacement, even exile. So all of these are place-based notions that that get represented within an artistic tradition. And so I'm interested in the kind of almost phenomenological sense of how people are inhabiting their sense of home or missing it or something like that. So for me, that's the entree into the folk art tradition. Anyway, all of that to say that my connection may be a bit sporadic over the next little while, but that doesn't mean that you should it's time to go to the beach or something like that. Presentations will continue as as they do. I'll even try and upload stuff from China, video stuff if I can. So so keep going on this. Keep commenting in the discussion threads. I think it's important that we stay on track in the course. Um, so you've started Kitcher's book now, and I think you've noticed quite a different kind of certainly writing style from what we saw with Code. And some of you maybe are welcoming that, and some of you not. I don't know. Kitcher is a kind of classic analytic philosopher in a certain sense, but a broad-minded analytic philosopher. He's not one who's simply interested in the kind of analysis of words or something like that. And so in that, he's like Code, he's interested in how philosophy plays itself out within real world problems. Code, of course, comes from her own background, which is a background of feminist philosophy, background rooted in Canada. And so there are a number of issues that she's picking up that you would have seen in her book as really the working out of epistemology. Not so much abstract epistemology, but what does it mean to generate knowledge or to understand what constitutes knowledge within a very much applied or lived setting. and what that means for her is that she's going to recognize that as we engage in the lived world, there are things that we may know intellectually. You know, we may understand that are not legitimate ways to approach epistemology or ethics or something like that, but that haven't actually reached our behavior yet. So that's why she is interested in, for example, in her last chapter, um, with the excuse me, with the whistleblower case, because she's going to say, look, there's a representation of knowledge here which nonetheless doesn't, even though we know that this person needs to be taken seriously, what we've ended up doing in the kind of representation of her is fall into old patterns. And so she's concerned about that kind of thing. So that, I mentioned that as a segue to Kitcher, because Kitcher in a certain sense is going to also be interested in how knowledge is actually produced. He is in some ways an applied epistemologist in this sense. He's well known as a philosopher of science, and so he certainly is he's very, it's very clear that he knows all of the standard epistemological stuff. This is not this is certainly part of his training and part of his past writing. But what he's interested in this book is the question of essentially the science debates. If our course is about knowledge, responsibility, and society, I think he gives us a great example or a great set of questions about what does it mean to produce knowledge in a society where you don't have the kind of authority structure that you may once have had. Scientists are not priests. There's a democratic sensibility which allows a wide variety of opinions to take hold within the public sphere, including opinions that scientists may regard as non or even anti-scientific. These are all part of the public discourse. And so I think he's interested in the question of, is there any legitimacy to some of the criticisms of the people who would criticize science? And on the other hand, how does science operate within what is essentially a kind of space where not everyone takes the results of science or even the assumptions of science seriously? And so he's going to use the first part of the book, and that's what Janice has talked about, the first part of the book to establish his view of science. And it's a view which I think moves him away from the positivist notions of science. And in that sense, he is certainly like Code. I mean, Code, I think, would agree with him, to move away from that positivism, that notion that somehow science just simply gives us a truth about the world, and it's based on, as it were, positive evidence, the old Comtean sort of notion, and and then we can sort of build up in a kind of linear fashion. We've discovered this truth, and then we move to that truth, and we just build our knowledge about the world in that kind of manner. Kitcher's not going to subscribe to that kind of approach, and I think the examples he chooses are really interesting. I'm interested in particular in his analogy of mapping, because I think it's a great example, and B, he doesn't actually perhaps even go far enough with it. He is trying to give us a picture of science which is realist. So he's not into a kind of constructivist version of science where we suppose that reality is just being constructed by our view of the world. He's not in that camp of constructivist. So he's in the camp of realists, but a particular kind of realism. Not a positivist realism, as I just said. It's a realism which supposes that at best we have partial purchase on reality, and that is governed by a set of concerns that we have at any given time. And to that extent, you can actually, and perhaps surprisingly, even hear echoes of Foucault in this. I mean, Foucault's notion of the episteme is, a lot of people think that Foucault is simply a flat-out constructionist. Well, that's not necessarily the case. He is interested in the ways that our manners of constructing our discourses about the world change over time and have a set of similarities across different domains at a particular time. And so for Foucault, his discussions of the 19th century are especially interesting because he said, look, our discussion of sexuality is mirrored in our construction of prisons and clinics and schools and governments and all of these sorts of things. Doesn't mean that it's all made up. What it means is that what we do is we carry a set of concerns and then we duplicate our models for understanding the world across different domains. Kitcher doesn't go quite that far, but I think he's on the same path. I mean, he's, in his discussion of mapping in chapter 5, he is trying to give us a sense of the notion that the world has a set of concerns. There is no comprehensive map, as he says. There is no map of everything, as Jorge Luis Borges talked about. The map. One of his stories, he talked about a map that was a one-to-one representation of the territory. And so the map was as big as the territory itself and represented properly everything that was in the territory. Short of that, it's a set of choices. And, so that set of choices, even with something like Google Maps, where you can layer on different kinds of, you can have a terrain map and you can have a street map and a political map or whatever, even with the ability to layer choices on, you still don't have a comprehensive notion of a map. And so what Kitcher's trying to say, I think, in his analogy to science is that science, just as Foucault said, is a set of concerns at a time, and sometimes we don't even really we're not consciously aware of what those concerns actually are. It only comes out after the fact, as we proceed down a particular path and we start understanding what those concerns are. As we start working down the scientific path, we understand what the limitations of that, of our scientific approaches actually are. And so I think for Kitcher, his notion of the map is interesting because it has a sense of both realism and partiality about it. The map isn't just a map of nothing. It's not a imaginative map for him. It's a map of something. It's a map of reality, but it's a I don't even want to call it a partial map of reality, because that supposes that you could add them all up or something like that. I think it's even more, it lies between the notions of the world out there and the our sets of concerns in here that we are only coming to know as we put them out there, as we research in science. This is an approach within literature that we're familiar with. You read a book, and to some extent, the book reads you. The book brings you out. The book shows you for who you are. People read the Bible, for example, and some of them come up with, the most extreme racist notions, and others come up with the most egalitarian and compassionate notions, and some come up with certain forms of government, and some come up with others, and certain economics, and others come up with others. And the Bible is in a certain sense reading us when we do that. Does that mean that there's nothing there? Does that mean it's just like a total blank slate that we project ourselves onto? Well, no, it doesn't. There is still something there, but there's also something here that we meet in the middle. And so I think that's what Kitcher's trying to do with his notion of science as a map. I guess, as I said a moment ago, I'd like to see him go a bit further, and the bit further that I'd like to see him go is to substitute the map for a chart. I mean, a chart is a different kind of thing than a map. I mean, a map is still a textual representation. A chart is something that's much more tentative, that is you engage in, during an activity that you're making up as you go, as it were. That is often erased and redrawn and things like that. I mean, a map in a certain sense precedes a chart. And, the doing of science in some ways feels more like charting than it does like mapping sometimes. It feels more like an exploration than it does a textualization of the world. Again, a chart doesn't suppose that there's no world out there, but a chart supposes that our engagement with it is a much more tentative engagement, I suppose. What's interesting about maps is that if you look at their history, and I talk about maps in my Place in Space course, if you look at their history, you will see that not only is it about a set of concerns that we have, but it changes modalities. And what I mean by that is the move from the maps of the Middle Ages and before up into the modern period is a move from maps that are about place to maps that are about space. In other words, in the Middle Ages and before, what you had were maps that showed that showed the world in terms of the significant places to people. So they're more like charts in a certain sense, because you would see a map of Europe, and the map was the map of the places that pilgrims would travel to on the way to Santiago de Compostela or to Jerusalem or whatever. And they didn't look much like maps from our point of view, because what happens in the beginning of the modern era is that we substitute space for place. In other words, we substitute a kind of abstract grid, lines of longitude and latitude, and then we simply put in whatever happens to be there. I mean, before the advent of that kind of map, you wouldn't necessarily map the ocean because there's nothing there. After, you do map the ocean because there's a line of longitude and latitude, and if it happens to be water there, well, that's what you put in, right? And so there is a very different sensibility to how these things work. And again, we're talking metaphorically here, I suppose, but Kitcher introduced the notion of the metaphor, and specifically the notion of the map. And so I think it's also worth thinking about, if he's going to use a metaphor like that for science, what other sensibility could it possibly have? I mean, it feels to me like he's talking almost like a pre-modern map. This is why I introduced the notion of the chart. So he kind of establishes all of this that it's a limited view of science. It's a robust but limited view of science. It's not a view of science that's giving us the God's eye view of the world or something like that. And what we're going to see after this, in the sections after this, he's going to turn to the question of democracy and how science can operate within a democratic sphere. And you can see him already laying the groundwork for a sort of answer to that. If science isn't what a priesthood does, the priesthood in the white lab coats, if that's not it, if it's more like drawing maps that have certain kind of preoccupations that are tied to their times and tied to their places and all of that sort of thing, you can see him opening the door to the questions of democracy, but not in the sense that it's just a free-for-all or that it's just whatever the mob wants or something like that. I mean, it's not, again, it's not that kind of simple political or subjective outworking of whatever people happen to want at a time. So what does that do to our discussion in this course, knowledge, responsibility, and society? Well, you can see Kitcher opening the door to a certain version of knowledge. It is, in a certain sense, a version that's going to complicate someone like Aristotle, I think, because for Aristotle, knowledge is about figuring out the universals that are embedded within the world, that are embedded within things. And we could be right or wrong about those, or we might not have access or knowledge about those, but nevertheless, it's about what's out there. And Kitcher seems to be resisting the notion that it's about universals, even though he wants to talk about a reality that's out there, that's independent of us. And so that opens the door to the criticism that could be made against Kitcher, which is, doesn't he, at the end of the day, succumb to a kind of a relativism in all of this? How is he going to anchor that knowledge such that it's not simply a matter of whatever somebody wants at a particular time? I mean, I think he certainly doesn't want to go that way. I mean, it's clear that that's not his agenda. Nevertheless, is that a consequence? And you can think about that. The question of responsibility ties to this, certainly political responsibility, because one of the things that motivates political responsibility is a shared sense of knowledge about something. I mean, certainly within ethics, if you have a totally relativist version of ethics, it's very hard to have responsibility towards anything. It would be, for example, very hard to criticize South Africa during the apartheid regime for instituting apartheid laws. That's what they do there. That's their opinion about it there. That's their ethical stance, even. That's their sense of knowledge. We have something different here. And of course, we didn't take that route. I mean, we were, thankfully critical of it. And the combination of action within South Africa and pressure from outside, meant that apartheid came to an end. But on what grounds, right? I mean, does someone like Kitcher, the discussion of apartheid isn't necessarily a discussion of science, but it is a discussion of how far responsibility can extend. you know, to put it within specifically scientific terms, you know, are we faced with you know, a kind of relativism on climate change, for example, on you know, like what about the kind of discoveries of science or scientific theory is is robust enough to motivate large scale responsibility about things? You know, so that's the question. You know, do we at the end of the day have to say, and he's going to talk about creationists here, so do we at the end of the day have to say to creationists, well, that's your truth about it, that's your map, as it were, we've got a different map, you know, and that's just how it is. I mean, that does seem to fall into the kind of creationist pattern of certainly high school education, where you're supposed to teach the controversy and you're supposed to have all of these positions recognized and so forth. You know, that's, from a scientific point of view, that's a real problem. I mean, you know, as scientists will argue, well, that opens the door to all sorts of other weird and crazy things, and you know, something that doesn't have robust scientific support, or at least enough to meet the standards that have you know, supported evolution over the years. You know, that shouldn't be taught as if it has, the same amount of support. You know, so all of these controversies, right? So, you know, it's going to be interesting for Kitcher because he does have a real problem in front of him. You know, the kind of older version of science, which is essentially positivist, simply says we have the priests in the white lab coats. What they say is true. What you end up with is the potential for scientific abuse, right? Code wants to avoid that. Kitcher wants to avoid that. If you open the door to science having any democracy as part of it, how do you handle that? Code handles it in terms of her ecological thinking, her notion of communities. That's not Kitcher's approach. He's going to do something else with it, but he's still, like Code, opening the door to something else. And so, you know, I think he's set up a very interesting problem for himself, and you know, I think he's done a very nice job of backing science off from its positivist framework. So let's see in the next section how he does with the you know, these really hard questions that he's going to be facing. All right, see you again soon.